Section 10. Decolonization of Africa. Introduction. In this study section, you will examine the process of the abandonment by the Western powers of their former colonies in Africa, a long process preceded by the nationalist struggles. These struggles and negotiations climax with granting of independence to colonized African countries. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this section, you should be able to 1. Discuss the link between Second World War and the growth of nationalist movements in Africa. 2. Describe the decolonization process in African countries. World War II and the growth of nationalist movements in Africa. The Second World War ended in 1945, but it influenced the growth of nationalist movements in Africa. One of the important influences was because when Britain, one of the greatest colonial masters, lost her prestige at the initial stage of the war as a result of defeat by Japan, a non-European power. Africans saw this as a weakness on the part of Britain and therefore psychologically imbued the colonized people of Africa to be determined to get their freedom from Britain. President Roosevelt of America and Winston Churchill of Britain met to sign the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, which gave the right to all peoples to choose the form of government under which they would live, was an added impetus for the Africans to demand for their freedom. It could be recalled that both President Roosevelt of America and Winston Churchill of Britain were signatories to the Charter. While Churchill interpreted this declaration to mean that it applied only to European states, President Roosevelt maintained that the clause applied to all humanity regardless of race, creed, and other criteria. Besides, the USA and Russia even questioned the moral foundations of colonialism. In fact, all this acted as a catalyst, forcing Britain to grant independence to overseas countries like India, Pakistan, Burma, and Ceylon. Finally, the Second World War also promoted the formation of political parties in Africa, which of course contributed to struggle for independence movements in Africa. Besides, the post-war depression worsened the economic condition of the Africans, which led to frustration and bitterness against colonial domination. This depression, of course, encouraged political dissatisfaction, which consequently promoted nationalist movements in Africa. The road to independence in Africa. The road to independence in Africa varied from region to region. This was because African countries were colonized by different European nations. Thus, in understanding the road to independence in Africa, the explanation shall be divided into 3, namely, nationalism in British Africa, nationalism in French Africa, and nationalism in the rest of Africa. This is important because nationalism preceded decolonization in Africa. Nationalism and decolonization in British Africa. The British no doubt colonized many of the African countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Gambia in West Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Somalia in East Africa, Zambia, and Southern Africa, etc. In Africa generally, the British began to experience opposition to foreign rule in about the 1930s. Initially, it started with the demand by the nationalists for more participation in the administration of the colonies. However, by 1945, precisely after the Second World War, it changed to agitations for self-governance and independence as a result of both internal and external factors. Notable nationalists in the British African countries were Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Obafemi Awolowo, Nigeria, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya, Julius Nyerere, Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia, and Milton Obote, Uganda. The struggle of these personalities against the British colonial administration facilitated the granting of independence to their countries. Decolonization in French Africa. France pursued the colonization process in Africa with enormous resources and commitment. Thus, at the end of the scramble for colonies, France was a country to beat in terms of possession in Africa. Unlike the British Africa, nationalism started late in French Africa because France operated a different system of administration from Britain in administering her possessions. Gradually, each colony began to have second thought. Subsequently, they demanded full independence by about 1960. Also, in the 1960s, the 4 French colonies of Equatorial Africa, namely Chad, Gabon, Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, and Central African Republic, received their independence. In the French North Africa, particularly in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba led a nationalist group who protested against the domination of the assembly by the French. Although he was not tolerated by the French authority as he was exiled along with the Sultan in 1954, negotiations resumed between the nationalists and the French, which ended in granting of self-government to this colony in 1955. Similar thing was experienced in Morocco after the Second World War, where the nationalists and Sultan Mohammed Ben Youssef mounted pressure on the French administration in Morocco, which culminated in the independence of Morocco in 1956. In the case of Algeria, it was rebellion and armed struggle because a section of the French army and the French settlers also rose in rebellion against the French government, fearing that it would grant independence to the colony. Similarly, in South Africa, the independence was delayed because the country had to face the problem of apartheid, which was adopted as a policy in 1948. In fact, African National Congress (ANC) and other African political movements had to struggle it out with the Europeans until the 1990s, when the legal apparatus of apartheid was dismantled. It can therefore be seen that the process of decolonization in Africa was not through the round-the-table agreement between the Africans and the Europeans, but rather varied as dictated by circumstances in the various places. Studies section summary. In this studies section, you highlighted catalysts to decolonization. You also observed the nature of the process across board. This is the end of studies section 10. Thanks for listening.